Alright guys, welcome back to the channel. It's Matty here, and welcome back to Meta Monday. It's the weekly series where we analyze the metagame, we take a look at all of the best decks and how they're performing in the online Pokemon TCG Pocket tournaments. And yeah, we have a lot to talk about this week, so a lot has changed, and basically what we always do is we take a look at the Ursa Days Pocket Weekly. It's the largest weekly Pokemon TCG Pocket tournament. This week we had 1,600 players competing in this week's tournament, and as you can see here, we actually saw Celebi EX win. This is actually the first time that Celebi EX has won a major tournament, or I say major tournament, but really the first time it's won an Ursa Days Pocket Weekly. I think this is the 4th or 5th Ursa Days tournament of this new Mythical Island format. I say new now, it's been around for quite some time. In fact, the new format is basically only 2 weeks away, so I'm really excited. But let's get right into it, and let's take a look at the deck that won this week's tournament. So, shout out to Bob from Taiwan, Bob83727. Let's take a look at the deck list here, and then we'll look at the matchups. So this is really a, I call it the grass pile deck is what I call this. It's kind of the most common way to play Celebi EX. I think a lot of people over the last couple weeks have realized that Celebi is a strong card, especially with Jungle Totem. However, it does require kind of a late game board state, and it requires quite a few energies to be placed on that Celebi EX, even with Jungle Totem. So I think what a lot of people did to kind of balance the deck out was to incorporate things like Exeggutor EX, as sort of that lead off, that frontline Pokemon in Celebi. It's always been really good, but in this format, it's exceptionally really good. A lot of fast-paced decks, and it's just a really strong card. Paired with Erica's, which works for every single Pokemon in this deck, as well as Superior in the mid to late game. We can attack with that Solar Beam attack for only 2 energies. Now, the interesting thing with this deck is that we're actually running 1 copy of both Exeggutes. We have the Growth Spurt one from Mythical Island, which allows you to accelerate an additional energy to that Exeggcute, and we also have just the normal one that does 20 damage, but we're not running 2 Exeggutor EX in this list, or Bob wasn't, rather. He was running one of the new Exeggutor non-EX versions from Mythical Island, which does Psychic. It does 80 damage plus, I think 10 more for each energy attached to your opponent's active Pokemon. He was either 10 or 20, definitely 10 because 80 is quite a bit. But the cool thing with Jungle Totem and this Exeggutor, because they are technically definitely meant to go together to some degree, we can use this attack, which is quite strong, for really only 2 energies, which is a really high upside. It's also a single prize Pokemon, so in the scenario where maybe it's best for us to go into this Exeggutor, even if it gets KO'd, we can maybe go into our second Superior or something like that, right? It's nice to have single prize and 2 prize options in your deck to kind of pick and choose. But yeah, so this deck runs a lot of Pokemon. It runs, I think, what is this, 8 different types of Pokemon, and 12 Pokemon in total. So a lot of decks like this actually end up doing quite well. They're kind of high roller decks. Like you kind of, when you're building a deck in Pokemon Pocket, you really have 2 different ways or I guess strategies in which you can, construct your deck. One would be to really limit the amount of Pokemon. That way you increase the odds of starting with a particular Pokemon, because in Pocket you're guaranteed to start with a Pokemon. Or you can run a bunch of Pokemon and hope that you draw all the right Pokemon that you need, right? So for something like Celebi, again, we do need a lot of Pokemon to get set up, right? We need Superior, we need Celebi, we want to lead off with Exeggutor. Similar to Charizard and the Charizard decks that are doing really well, you're running Moltres, you're running the whole Charizard line, then you're also maybe running Arcanine or maybe even a Mew EX. So this is really Grass-type Charizard in a lot of different ways. It's a little bit stronger in the early game, again, with Exeggutor, but again, it does have that really insane damage potential in the late game. And we still have some room for trainers in this deck, even though we're running 12 Pokemon rather, we of course are going to run 2 Research and 2 Pokeballs, so that really only leaves 4 spots left in the deck, and that's where we run the Ericas, which again is really good with Exeggutor, but it's also really clutch when you use it with Celebi as well. Celebi is a cool card because it's also kind of a tempo card where you can kind of lead off with it and start doing up to 100 damage on your second turn, which is really strong. In some scenarios, I think the main upside with Celebi, though, is that its late game damage is so high. But again, we're also running 1 potion, 1 X speed. So there's a lot of different ways to play grass type decks right now. This is kind of one of the decks that we've seen be the most played in terms of Celebi. Now, what I have been saying for the last few weeks, though, is that Exeggutor really is important because in its own right, it's such a good card. This deck is only running 1 copy of Exeggutor EX, but we are running technically 2 Exeggcutes and 2 copies of Exeggutor, both the single prize and the EX version. So a really cool deck list here. Let's take a look at Bob's matchups, and we'll see kind of the decks that he hit. So he played a total of 15 matches and actually went 14-1, which is a really tremendous record. I mean, it speaks for itself. But as we see here, The only match that we lost was against a Gyarados, and we only hit 2 Gyaradoses in this entire tournament. We'll take a look at the overall meta share of the tournament in a little bit. That's where we get into the details, and we'll uncover a lot of the information as to the meta, how things are forming, how things are shaping up. But yeah, we only played 2 Gyaradoses, and we went 50-50 against it. We hit, kind of a meme deck here in round 1, Exeggutor with Alakazam. We beat 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 Pikachus on this run. Celebi and Exeggutor in general has a really good Pikachu matchup, just because it's also got pretty decent pace, Exeggutor that is. It can do pretty consistent damage. Pikachu doesn't do a ton of damage. With Erica's, with the potions, we can stay alive for quite a while and take an early KO, and then, go into that Celebi to take a one-hit KO right in the late game. So Celebi typically has a really strong Pikachu matchup. We knew that Pikachu would see a lot of play since it won last tournament, so it makes sense to play 5 different Pikachus and winning all of them. That's not a super big surprise. I do think that Celebi is just really strong against Pikachu. We beat 1, 2, only 3, yeah, so 3 different Mewtwo decks. This is kind of a 50-50. I think Mewtwo is in general, pretty even matchup against most other top decks in the format, so going 3-0 against Mewtwo is certainly still pretty impressive, and we played 1 Aerodactyl Farfetch's got the W there. I think that's a good matchup as well. And then a couple Bullfrog Greninja Tauros decks, which is certainly pretty interesting. So a pretty balanced matchup spread here, beating most of the top decks in the format. However, one thing that you'll probably notice here that is very glaring is that we hit 0 fire type decks. So we'll take a look at the meta share for sure, but interesting to note that, again, when you're playing a particular deck in Pocket and you're playing in tournaments, you kind of have to get a little bit lucky, especially in the top cut bracket. As we see here, basically 0 fire decks in 15 matches for the Celebi player, which kind of really opens up the gates for a player like this to have a really good run, because Celebi is a pretty strong deck. But again, these high roller decks that run a lot of different Pokemon, they do kind of require you to draw things properly. But on the upside, though, even though we have so many Pokemon in the deck and we are a little bit limited from our supporter choice and our trainer cards, really, that we can play in the deck, it basically always makes it so that we have Pokemon early in the game, tons of basic Pokemon, and we're just drawing into a lot of different copies of different Pokemon. So it's a different way to build your deck. You can either really limit the type of Pokemon or the amount of Pokemon in your deck, or, like I said, you can play a ton and hope that you draw into the right ones, right? So there's 2 different ways, basically, to play or to build your decks, rather, in Pokemon Pocket. But second place, we did see a Pikachu and Substrike. In fact, if we go down, we actually did see a Charizard here get 3rd place. It's always something that kind of at least does fairly well in the metagame. Charizard is a really strong deck. It's not really a top play deck. I think it's either 5th or 6th in terms of the most played decks in the current format. But because, again, it's such a strong upside, and it's just an absolute high roller deck, sometimes, at least one Charizard player, if enough people are playing Charizard, rather, is going to do well in the tournament. As we saw, though, this number 1 placing Celebi player here didn't play any Charizards, which is interesting. But yeah, so we saw one Charizard here get 3rd place, and then below, top 8 really dominated by Mewtwo's. Something to expect. Mewtwo is by far, the most common deck, I think, at the moment, and it has been, and it's no surprise. It hasn't won for a couple weeks, but really no shocker that we see 3 copies or 3 people playing Mewtwo EX in top 8. No Gyarados is in top 8, however, it did get the 9th place spot, going 10-2, and then we saw another Gyarados here in 14th place. Pretty interesting, but, a pretty balanced spread across the board. We're going to go down and we're going to take a look at this Exeggutor and Mew EX deck really soon, because I'm actually really, really high. There's a second one here in 17th place. This is a really fun deck. We'll take a look at it in a little bit, but let's quickly take a look. I just want to cover the deck lists first. Let's take a look at this player, Solemn TCG. And let's take a look at his Pikachu deck, see if anything's different from last week. Okay, so this is Pikachu and Substrike. However, we're running an extra copy of Zapdos, and we're not running the Electabuzz. It's really, it's interesting. I don't think it makes the deck a lot different. I do really like having the additional bench attacking option that is Electabuzz. And I don't think that Zapdos is super, super good, although last week we did see it kind of win the championship or the grand finals tournament for the Pikachu player, KOing a Mewtwo. So it can be good in certain scenarios. It's just a pretty inconsistent attacking card overall, and it doesn't have too much HP. However, 3 energies isn't a ton. So I don't know. I like Zapdos, but I think it's pretty situational. I think there's better, more consistent cards to play in Pikachu. However, we should always be playing the Dedenne and 2 copies of Pikachu for sure. So I think this is a very standard Pikachu and Substrike deck. Again, Pikachu won last week, so a lot of people were going to play Pikachu this week, and I don't think that's a really big surprise. Let's see what loads up here. I think let's look at the Charizard player. Or was it Pikachu? Oh, wait. We have to go to standings. Sorry. I was confused. I didn't know where I was here on the Limitless platform. Let's take a look at Kytheon from Japan, who went 11-1 and 2. So we did tie 2 games, which is interesting. But let's take a look at this Charizard deck. And I do believe that this is kind of emerging as the most popular way to play Charizard right now. Again, we have the full Charizard line and the Moltres line. That's the core of the deck. But we are also running 1 copy of Growlithe and Arcanine as sort of a backup option, just an additional Pokemon to potentially attack a little bit earlier in the game to attach those energies to from Inferno Dance. And it has to be on your bench. I learned that, or I didn't learn that, but somebody wanted to point that out because I forgot that briefly in my previous video. But yes, Moltres has to, you can only attach to your bench Pokemon. But the cool thing about this Charizard deck is we're also running Mew EX as a Pokemon that we can kind of slap onto our bench and manually attach to turn after turn. It's kind of a better manually attaching option than Moltres. Moltres only does 70 damage, so basically we're going to attach 1 energy to the Moltres. We're going to start using Inferno Dance. We're going to use Inferno Dance to power up our Charizard and our Arcanine because we cannot attach energies to a benched Mew EX with Moltres. It has to be a Fire-type Pokemon. However, instead of manually attaching every turn to the Moltres to maybe attack with it in the active spot and only do 70 damage, we're actually going to bench the Mew EX and probably choose to attach those basic energies to the Mew EX. Only 3 energies, it can be a really good option, especially against Mewtwo decks or Charizard decks, where it's just basically a second option in your deck that can potentially get a 1-hit KO, which is really good, but very similar as we see. So this Charizard deck, like I said, is very comparable to something like the Celebi deck that ended up winning. It's just a very similarly constructed deck. We're not playing Erika's, but we are playing like an extra Giovanni and Leaf, some X-Speed, so a lot of Pokemon is basically kind of what I call. But those are really the 2 high roller decks that ended up doing really well. Let's take a look at maybe one of these top Mewtwo players to see if anything's different. We always take a look at Mewtwo, but it really hasn't changed much since the beginning of the format. Still see the Mythical Slabs. We're playing Mew EX, no other real attacker in here. And we do have 1 copy of Red Card, which is an interesting pick. I don't necessarily think that, especially in an open deck list, if tournament setting, playing Red Card is necessarily that useful. Your opponent can always play around it. And in general, I think in this format, decks in the format in general is a little bit more faster paced. But the cool thing about Red Card is it is good against Charizard, and it can be good against Celebi, that cards that play Stage 2 Pokemon, so in the mirror match as well. So I think Mewtwo does benefit in certain scenarios in those worse matchups by playing Red Card, but I don't necessarily think that Red Card is a great card, at least in the format. I think you might benefit more from playing maybe a blue in the deck, which is what we are missing here and probably what our opponent swapped out for the Red Card. But overall, I think Mewtwo decks are all pretty similar. So next up here, what I want to do is I want to take a look. Let's go down maybe anything else that jumps out. Let's take a look at this Gyarados, the top placing Gyarados list of this tournament. Again, Gyarados is something that hasn't really changed much. It's been the same since about week 2 of this format. People are still playing Greninja and Druddigon. It's by far, I think, the best way to play Gyarados. And as we see here, 1 copy of Misty's, which is actually really interesting. Not playing 2 copies, which most Gyarados decks do. I wonder if that is sort of kind of an anomaly in terms of the highest placing Gyarados deck only playing 1 Misty. But in general, maybe you do benefit more from having the extra Leaf or the Sabrina in your deck. It's kind of a toss-up, but this deck also plays a lot of Pokemon, so we're limited for room from supporter cards. But, Gyarados doesn't necessarily rely on Misty. Yes, it can be good to get that Gyarados set up early, but most of the time, if your Magikarp doesn't get sniped on the bench, you kind of can just survive off the Druddigons and the Greninjas. It doesn't necessarily matter if you hit Misty's and you're able to set up that Gyarados a turn or 2 earlier. So, maybe this player is onto something, right? Maybe Gyarados doesn't necessarily benefit as much from Misty as we might have thought, especially in this particular format, right? There are a lot of Pikachu's Abstricus, there are a lot of, Hitmonlee fighting type decks, but, again, if that Magikarp doesn't go down, if you can evolve that Gyarados, it doesn't necessarily matter if you're able to attack on turn 3 or turn 4. It's oftentimes maybe not the difference. Plus, by then, you might have already drawn into your 1 copy of Misty's anyway. And early in the game, we're probably going to be playing Professor's Research more so anyway as well. So I think it's actually kind of smart. It kind of makes a lot of sense, but okay, so here's what I want to do. I want to take a look here at the Exeggutor and Mew deck list. So this is something that's a little bit new here. Or not this one. This is kind of the older way of playing just sort of straight Exeggutor. And this was the higher placing one, but the next one is a little bit different. But this is kind of the other way to play grass decks right now. I do think that it's much less played than just Celebi EX with Jungle Totem and Exeggutor. But if you don't want to play Jungle Totem, which again is more of a late game deck, and if you want something that was a little bit more faster paced, a little bit more tempo focused, this is a really great option. Again, kind of really leaning into that early game Exeggutor EX, as well as the single prize Exeggutor, which is a very similar option here. Again, it does the same exact thing, it's just a little bit smaller. It does a little bit less damage. It does 30 or 60 instead of 40 or 80. But again, it still has that 1 energy attack cost. So it is a fairly good option, I think, in this deck. It basically gives you something to have in the front line early in the game, a little bit more consistently, basically running a third copy of Exeggutor, and I think it's actually really smart. Getting that early damage off while we power up our Celebi EX or our Mew EX on our bench is really smart. And again, a deck like this is primarily focused around Exeggutor, but Celebi and Mew are kind of those backup options to kind of take the last KO in the match. If we're playing Mewtwo, if we're playing Charizard, we would set up our Mew EX. However, if we're playing maybe any other type of deck that isn't, useful for Mew EX, maybe Pikachu, for example, we would choose to power up our Celebi. So really interesting. The other cool thing about this deck is we, again, and this is a stark contrast to some of those other decks that we saw, we have a lot of room for trainer cards. Now, a deck like this is a little bit more reliant on those Pokeballs because, again, maybe if we start with our Mew EX or Celebi, we're going to want to get that Execute on our bench as early as possible, so you really do need to draw into those Pokeballs early on. But again, it's fairly likely we have a 50-50 chance, basically, to start with Execute, so that's, an upside to the deck. Gives it a little bit more consistency in the early game, but not necessarily a guarantee. But yeah, the other side of the coin, basically. But the other, Exeggutor deck that I wanted to take a look at, which is this version, is one that I am particularly really high on. So we're not seeing, in this deck, we don't see a copy of that single prize Exeggutor EX, but instead of Celebi, we're actually just playing Tauros. So the reason I really like this deck is because Tauros combined with Mew EX is one of the best pairings in the entire game. I've been saying it since the beginning of Mythical Island when these cards all came out. Mew EX is really good in certain scenarios, again, like Charizard and Mew EX, or not Mew EX, Charizard and Mewtwo EX, where Tauros really covers a lot of those matchups where Mew isn't necessarily super useful. Tauros does 120 damage to EX Pokemon. Combined with Giovanni, we do 130. That is enough to one-hit KO a ton of different Pokemon in the game. Things like Zapdos, Pikachu, Celebi, Articuno. There's just a lot. A lot of EX Pokemon have either 120 or 130 HP, and a lot of those same, matchups are ones that Mew EX aren't necessarily, isn't that useful against. So the combination of Mew EX and Tauros is really good. The deck has a really consistent, really kind of, easy to understand sort of strategy. You want to lead off with Exeggutor. You want to get early damage off. We do have Ericas in the deck, and we are able to basically stay alive, hopefully take 1 or 2 KOs with that Exeggutor as our lead off. And then in the late game, we should have time at least to attach 3 energies to either our Tauros or our Mew EX to finish up the matchup, depending on what our opponent is playing. And again, we have tons of room for supporter cards in here. We have 2 Ericas, 2 Giovanni, 2 Leaf, 2 Sabrina. So basically, because Exeggutor is really strong and it sticks around a lot of times into the mid to late game, the chances are that we have really any of these supporter cards in our hand that we will need, like Giovanni or Sabrina in the mid to late game to finish the game, is pretty high. So it's a really consistent deck. It has, it's very flexible, and it basically has no bad matchups. There's really nothing in the game that's bad against this particular deck. Like I said, we're strong against Charizard and Mewtwo because of Mew EX, and we're good against Pikachu, Celebi, and other decks because of Tauros. So I really like this deck. I think that it flows exceptionally well. I actually, at the beginning of the format, I made an anti-meta Weezing with deck with Mew EX and Tauros, similar to this. It was basically the exact same deck, but instead of the Exeggutor package with Ericas and Potions, we were running Weezing with, Koga and Budding Expeditioner and things like that. So a very similar list, but again, I think the combination of Mew EX and Tauros is just really strong. So I don't necessarily think that people are going to play this deck. It got 17th, so some people might notice that it was a pretty impressive deck in this tournament, but I think for the most part, people aren't necessarily going to choose to play a deck like that over just sort of the grass pile Celebi deck that we saw previously. But let's quickly and take a look at this Pidgeot deck that went 9-2 and did make it into top 32. So Pidgeot, I've always put sort of in the B tier, sometimes the C tier, maybe low A tier at the very highest. I don't necessarily think Pidgeot EX in itself is a super strong card. However, when we're pairing it up with this fighting type aggro package, it does make the deck a little bit more front heavy, which again is going to be really good in certain scenarios. It definitely boosts up your Pikachu matchup, which is certainly really good. And again, it's just really strong in the early game with Hitmonlee, Marshadow, and Farfetch'd. This core, this early game aggro core that we see in a lot of different decks right now. Sometimes people pair it with Greninja or with Primeape or what is it, Aerodactyl. So there's a lot of different decks that are playing this. This combination of these fighting type cards that are all really fast-paced and aggressive. But we see here pairing it up with Pidgeot EX is probably the best way to play Pidgeot right now. The cool thing with Pidgeot is it's very flexible. But again, all of these Pokemon here that we see in the deck paired with Pidgeot have low energy attack costs. So we should be able to get 3 energies on Pidgeot in the mid to late game to kind of finish up some KOs. Hopefully we can use Pokeflute to put one of those Pokemon that we've KO'd early in the game on their bench and take some KOs to clean up the matchup with Pidgeot. I really do think that this combination is really effective, and I think that it makes a lot of sense in my opinion. So if we're playing Pidgeot EX, I do think that this is the best way to play Pidgeot right now. If we scroll down here is where we get into sort of some of these non-necessarily like super popular decks, like some of these Greninja decks that are, this is going to be a Greninja and Farfetch deck. If we can pull this up, this is probably going to be one of those, flex decks between Greninja and the aggro fighting type deck, like we just literally talked about. And here it is. So again, very similar deck, but instead of Pidgeot, we're running Greninja. And again, it's just another flavor of these aggro fast type fighting type decks. Not going to talk too much about it. We've talked about it a lot previously. And down here we have some Bullfrog decks, which I'm not super surprised by, but aggro fighting in general has really seen a significant drop off. And once we get into the metagame, we'll talk a little bit about, what this all looks like. So let's quickly take a look at the last list. This is going to be, this is the highest placing, Aerodactyl deck in here, which again, kind of incorporates Mew EX with Aerodactyl EX, again, with that core package of Hitmonlee, Farfetch'd, and Marshadow. So it's a really effective engine, and it has been really impressive, but I think for the most part, people are necessarily not going all in on the fighting type strategy. They're really just playing those 3 cards and then pairing them up in a variety of different ways. None of it has really ended up being like a top tier deck or necessarily the most play deck in the format, and there's a lot of different ways to play it, so people haven't necessarily all gravitated or agreed on how to play the deck. And typically when any particular archetype isn't like completely understood in terms of how people should be playing it, less people will choose to play that archetype, which meaning, less people are playing a particular deck means the less opportunity it has to do well in a tournament of this size. So that's typically why we see they're kind of falling down here outside of top 32, going 8-2, which is a very respectable record if we, if we're being honest here. But again, it just it's a little bit more difficult for them to break it into top 32 as we saw. So these Greninja decks did make it into top 32. We did see that Pidgeot deck make it into top 32, and a couple of those Exeggutor Mew decks also make it into top 32, or even higher as well. But overall, mostly just all the most common decks making it up there. A lot of Mewtwo, like we saw. But here's what we're gonna do, right? So let's go into the metagame, and I just want to quickly. Actually, before we do that, I know I'm jumping around a little bit. I want to actually showcase the records after just the first day of Swiss rounds, right? So basically, they do all of these Swiss rounds, they do 10 rounds, and then the top 32 players make it into the top cut bracket, and that's where we just looked at the overall rankings of everything sort of combined. But this was the standings after the first day of competition, after the first 10 rounds of Swiss, and as we saw, that Exeggutor Mew deck with Tauros actually was the #1 seed. So this tournament went undefeated, or this deck rather, went undefeated in the first day of tournament, went 9 wins, 0 losses, and 1 tie. So very impressive. And again, if people that are maybe are a little bit on the fence about a deck like this Exeggutor deck playing Tauros and Mew, it is extremely good. It doesn't have any bad matchups, and again, going undefeated in the first day of competition is really impressive. We also saw that Pidgeot and Hitmonlee player going 9-1. So this was what it looked like basically. These were the decks that were all at the top before getting into top cut. Swiss rounds are very different than top cut again, because it's not like single elimination or anything. You just kind of play 10 matches basically, and once you get into top cut bracket, things become very matchup focused. But overall, these were the best decks after the first day of competition, which is a little bit more interesting. As we see here, Mewtwo not really at the top, but a ton of Mewtwo's are going to fall within that 8 wins, 7 wins region, and same with Gyarados as well, right? So let's go ahead now. Let's take a look at the metagame. This is where we really get into it, and we talk about how things are changing and how things are progressing in the current metagame right now. Again, at the end of this Mythical Island format, really interesting to see how things have developed over time. But again, there is some really apparent triangulation, as somebody commented below in a previous video. Triangulation in the metagame right now, meaning that some decks are kind of related. They're almost on a string. One deck goes up, one goes down, and they kind of bounce and they go back and forth. So it's really interesting to visualize this and see week to week. If you don't follow all of my videos, all of my meta report videos, it really is kind of a series. So you get sort of the full scope of things if you watch every week, and you get to see how things are changing and how things are reacting to each other. So I would definitely recommend it. Don't forget to subscribe, hit that like button, and hit that notification bell to stay notified, because we do videos almost every day here on the channel, and we do meta reports every week. So this was the overall meta share of the tournament, guys. So these were the most played decks. As we see, Mewtwo and Gardevoir, by far actually this week, the #1 most played deck, falling really closely to 50% win rate. Very common here. Mewtwo has been the most played deck for a long time. The main reason for this is it's inherently very strong, it's consistent, and it doesn't have significant matchups that are terrible for it. Yes, Scolipede is a bad matchup for Mewtwo, but again, it's only had 21 people playing this deck out of 1,600 people. So yes, there are sort of niche dark type decks that are strong against Mewtwo, but overall, nothing really prominent in the metagame right now is significantly strong against Mewtwo. Maybe other than like that Exeggutor deck with Mew EX and things like that, or maybe some of the Greninja decks focusing with Mew EX, but for the most part, it has a good Pikachu, Gyarados, Celebi, and even Charizard matchup now because of Mew EX. So it makes sense that Mewtwo has floated around the most played deck in the format. This week, no different, 328 players, again, floating around 50%. It's kind of what we oftentimes see. And the reason why we're just under 50% is because we did tie 9 times. It really was a 50% win rate deck, and we see that oftentimes with decks that are by far the most popular. And then second up was actually Pikachu and Zebstrika, and if we look, Pikachu and Raichu actually fell all the way down here, only 19 people playing Pikachu and Raichu. So if you combine this, that's 19 plus 27, and that would be 256 people playing Pikachu, which is definitely the second most played deck, and it actually had a pretty tough win rate this week. We see only 47%, and there's a big reason for this. I knew that Pikachu would see sort of an uptick in play because last week Pikachu actually won the Ursa Days Pocket Weekly, beating Mewtwo in the finals. If you want to see a replay of that match or a commentary of the grand finals, I did make a video on that as well, so definitely go check that out. But yeah, so Pikachu was going to see an increase in play this week because it won last week. That's just always how it works. People like to hop on the bandwagon. But because Gyarados has been struggling basically due to this massive influx of Pikachu EX, and I should note that the week before last week, Gyarados won, which is why Pikachu was by far one of the most played decks last week and ended up taking the win. And basically as a result of all of this, that over the last couple of weeks, we've seen a dramatic decrease in people playing Gyarados, basically because the massive rise of Pikachu, and because Pikachu really dominated last week, people kind of figured that Gyarados wouldn't be a smart matchup, and which is why I think we saw that decks that were kind of really strong against Pikachu ended up winning this week, which is really Celebi. I think Celebi has a really strong matchup, and Exeggutor have a really strong matchup against Pikachu, and it won this weekend. And that kind of, again, is that triangulation. That's how things all kind of formulate here. The decrease of Gyarados makes a lot of sense. In fact, we still had a 51% win rate. So yes, less people were playing Gyarados and Greninja, but it is still inherently one of the strongest decks in the format. Even with a big, massive increase of people playing Pikachu, Gyarados and Greninja just ends up going 50%. And that's because if we look at the matchups, which we will do, and we go and we filter by the score. So, terrible win rate here against Pikachu, but actually a really good win rate against Mewtwo. So I kind of spoke too soon. Typically, this matchup spread isn't as bad on the Mewtwo side of things, but this week, Gyarados heavily dominated Mewtwo. So it also does well against Celebi, and it does well against Charizard. So there's a lot of upside to Gyarados. I do think that it probably deserves to see more play. I think some people are a little bit bored of Gyarados. They maybe want to make more significant meta calls, but I think right now, since Celebi won this week and Pikachu, didn't do necessarily as well, even though it did get second place, Pikachu's going to fall back down, Gyarados will go back up, Celebi will go back up, and it will really bring the metagame into a much more even space. I do think that it really opens up room for Mewtwo. I've been calling a Mewtwo win over the last couple weeks, but this week Celebi ended up getting that win. But overall, I think Mewtwo is still a really good choice leading up into the next couple weeks, and I think it will be, mainly just because it's just so consistent. But since Celebi won this week, I think maybe we might see more Charizard see play next week, but also Gyarados, I think, probably gonna see another uptick, another rise in people playing it, which wouldn't necessarily be a surprise. But let's quickly, I'm actually gonna go ahead, I'll track back a little bit, and we'll take a look at the matchups for Pikachu and Zebstrika. We'll take a look at the matchup spread. So actually a very bad win rate this week against Mewtwo. Again, this typically falls around the 45 to 46% win rate here, but again, only 39%. So Mewtwo and Gardevoir, kind of people probably, understanding maybe that matchup a little bit better, or maybe building their decks in a way that is a little bit stronger against Pikachu might result in a lower win rate in this matchup for Pikachu players. Again, only a 40% win rate is pretty interesting for sure. Again, Gyarados still really strong, but again, look, really bad win rates against Celebi decks as well, and a pretty good matchup against Charizard. So that's something to keep in note. But also aggro fighting decks are always going to be strong against Pikachu. So I've been saying this for quite some time. The thing with Pikachu is that it doesn't have like a really solid matchup spread in this current format. As we see, these win rates are pretty variable. Like, this is a pretty stark contrast, right? Like 40% win rate to the 75% win rate to 35 to 60. So like, it's not a super balanced win rate that Pikachu has. But the thing is, it's such a fast-paced deck. It's very consistent. It's a really consistent damaging deck that even if matchups that aren't necessarily good for you, you always have a pretty good chance just to draw well and get that early damage off. Also, going second is really strong for Pikachu, so you have that advantage. And again, sometimes you just go ahead and you play a bunch of Gyaradoses and you win, right? So the thing with Pikachu though is it's never had like a super high overall win rate, but surprisingly it's always kind of remained as one of the most popular decks, and there are going to be those players that do really well with it. So we often see Pikachu heavily represented in the top brackets, but overall the overall win rate in tournaments for Pikachu is always like under 50%. It's just interesting that people are choosing to play Pikachu, but it's not about going 50%, right? It's about, you know, are you going to be one of those players that goes, you know, 9-1 or 8-2 in the first day to make it into day 2? That's just sort of what it comes down to. But overall, interesting for sure to see 47% win rate for Pikachu. But let's take a look at Celebi and Exeggutor, which is different. This is a different archetype than Celebi and Superior. So I basically kind of talk about this every week here, but it's something to note. Limitless categorizes these decks differently. Basically, all Celebi decks do fall under these two categories. 103 players and 63 players, so 166 players, basically tied for third place as the third most played deck in the tournament. But the reason these are categorized differently, basically, is that all of the Celebi decks that are running 2 copies of Exeggutor EX in it get categorized as this, Exeggutor and Celebi. And the deck that we saw, like the championship winning deck this week, only running 1 copy of Exeggutor EX, gets classified as Celebi and Superior. Basically, very similar archetypes here, practically the same. But again, what we see though is that the version that doesn't run 2 copies, 2 copies of Exeggutor and Celebi, always has an overall lower win rate by about 7% on average every week. So the statistics rather would tell you that playing Exeggutor in Celebi makes the deck that much better, as we see in the win rate here, 52% compared to 45%. However, this was the version technically that ended up winning this week's tournament, but overall we kind of categorize them as the same. They're very, very similar lists, but again, I would always recommend to play 2 copies of Exeggutor because it is just so good, especially for the, you know, the Celebi deck is basically what I'm getting at. But 166 players. Let's take a look at the matchup spreads for this Celebi deck, and this will give us an overall understanding of how Celebi matches up in this current format. So actually have a 53.5% win rate against Mewtwo and Gardevoir, which is actually a little bit surprising. However, I do think that it's I guess it's interesting. I think that this deck has a little bit more faster paced potential, and it has a little bit more upside. It's basically like Charizard, except you're not really playing any cards that Mew EX is strong against. And I think that's a big reason why Mewtwo maybe struggles a little bit more against Exeggutor than Charizard, because Mew EX isn't really helpful in the Celebi matchup. Yes, you can copy Celebi's attack, but you're only flipping 3 heads because Jungle Totem effect obviously doesn't work for you. And, you know, the opportunity to do 150 damage by flipping heads just really isn't that strong. We kind of have to lean on Mewtwo in that matchup, and you're not one-hit KOing Exeggutor without Giovanni. So there's a lot of different scenarios. Also, Exeggutor really, again, fast-paced and aggressive early in the match. So it kind of makes sense that Mewtwo doesn't have a great matchup against this particular deck. But the thing that stands out to me is a 66% win rate against Pikachu and Substrike. So again, I think that's a big reason why Celebi ended up winning this week, because it is really good against Pikachu. Again, that triangulation is what I keep saying, that word. It's a good word, and it basically it's the cycle that, you know, every deck is strong against another deck, and it all kind of cycles, and depending on, you know, what decks see more play, more decks will see those, you know, opposite decks will see more success. So Celebi really good against Pikachu. More Pikachu means better opportunities for Celebi. It ended up winning this week's tournament. Celebi actually does struggle with Gyarados, though, which is something to note. I actually find this quite interesting. I'm not exactly sure why that's the case, other than the fact that, you know, Gyarados is just really, really good. I think it's probably because of Greninja, like Celebi being sort of focused on the late game. Basically, Greninja plus Gyarados is able to one-hit KO really anything in your deck, and I think that's probably why that's the case. You also have Druddigon, so you kind of have to rely on early game Sabrinas, but again, our damage is kind of placed in the late game, so it really does make a lot of sense now that I think about it, how Gyarados with Greninja is strong against Celebi. I really think that Druddigon and Greninja combination makes that matchup a lot better for Gyarados. So high win rate against Pikachu, low win rate against Gyarados, but again, we saw a decline in Gyarados play this week. And yeah, losing win rates against the fire decks, although we didn't see much fire deck representation here in the top cut. And yeah, so overall it's interesting. I think, again, kind of getting carried by that, you know, that good matchup against Pikachu, because a lot of people played Pikachu this week. But either way, pretty interesting for sure that our win rate against Mewtwo was that high. Definitely interesting to note. So only 73 people playing Charizard and Moltres. However, if we go down here, we do see that 52 people were playing Charizard and Arcanine EX. The difference between these, again, is basically, are you playing 2 copies of Arcanine, or are you playing 1 copy of Arcanine with Mew EX, like we took a look at earlier? That's how these decks are differentiated in the metagame breakout here on Limitless. However, we can kind of effectively categorize them as the same deck. If we combine them, that's 155 people playing this archetype, which would sit it in 5th place, basically, like we've seen. So pretty low win rates across the board for Charizard. Again, I think that the high amount of Pikachu, which has a good matchup against Charizard, is probably the reason for that, if I had to guess. But let's take a look at the matchups again, just to kind of see what things are looking like for the Charizard decks. Very bad win rate against Mewtwo, man. How things changed. Like in Genetic Apex, Charizard really was, like in the last format, Charizard was that one deck that had a really good Mewtwo matchup. Pikachu was strong against Charizard, Charizard was strong against Mewtwo, and Mewtwo overall was strong against Pikachu. That's how it was in Genetic Apex, but with Mew EX entering the format, things were a lot different for Charizard. And really what we saw was that Mewtwo, again, like as we see here, has a really decent win rate against Charizard, and Mew EX really is the reason for that. But we also don't have a great win rate against Gyarados and Greninja, and we don't have a good win rate against Pikachu and Substrika. So really all the top decks in the format right now, we kind of struggle against. However, we are strong against Celebi, so that's something to keep in mind. We might see a massive increase in Celebi next week, which could open up the path for these Charizard decks to come in and do really well. But again, they're never going to break, I don't think, like into that top 3 most played deck. It might be the 4th most played deck next week if Pikachu or Gyarados really takes that big of a fall down or drop down. But I don't really see Charizard in any degree being, a top 3 most played deck. But we can always expect it to do well. I think it would be kind of a, not necessarily a shocker, but it would be interesting to see how many Charizards do well or make it into top cut next week. That's the thing though with Charizard, it's a little bit tougher for it to get into the top cut bracket, but the Charizards that do make it into top cut always have the opportunity to just pop off and do really good. And as we see here, a really large decline in play from these aggro fighting decks. It's been on the decline really every week. I think for the most part, people were playing this deck because it was strong against Pikachu and it was strong against Gyarados, but I think most people decided that we would rather have a better matchup against Mewtwo, so we've kind of decided, a lot of these players, to just play Pikachu and Substrika. It's the better aggro deck, it's the better, more fast-paced deck, so again, it just makes a lot of sense for us to play Pikachu and Substrika over these aggressive fighting-type decks. The other thing to note, though, is that, like I said, a lot of the archetypes are very vastly spread out. Most people aren't playing, Aerodactyl and Primeape, or Aerodactyl and Farfetch'd, right? A lot of people are playing this fighting type aggressive package in a lot of different ways. We see it here. Aerodactyl, Primeape, we see Greninja and Farfetch'd, we see Aerodactyl and Farfetch'd. We even saw Pidgeot playing the fighting type package, and down here we see Aerodactyl in the fighting package incorporating Mew EX. So really what you have to do is combine all of these archetypes, and that's the overall meta share for those aggressive fighting type decks. So I think things are just really spread out. We don't necessarily have like a definitive best way to play that fighting type package. And I think overall, a lot of people are choosing to play those big top 5 decks, which again are Mewtwo, Pikachu, Gyarados, Celebi, and Charizard. Those are the big 5. Everything else on the outside is a little bit more of a meta call. It's a little bit more niche. Scolipede, I think, in Weezing is its own really like solidified archetype, and people kind of know how to play it. But again, people are just choosing not to play Scolipede, again, because it really does struggle against everything in the format, aside from Mewtwo and kind of Pikachu. But overall, I think we would rather not play against a Pikachu if we're playing that Scolipede deck. So yeah, and this is what we oftentimes see. It's important to note that as the format goes on, people really kind of focus around those top decks, and in a lot of the meta share will get kind of stacked up to the top, as we see here. About, what is this, so 20, 15, so really about almost 50% of the tournament were playing these sort of top 5, top 6 decks, and that's really what we oftentimes see. As the format goes on, people really kind of figure out the best way to play decks. They really settle into archetypes that they like. They see the results from previous tournaments. I think this has been 4 or 5 weeks of the Ursa Days tournament in the Mythical Island format, and basically we've seen Mewtwo win, we've seen Pikachu win, we've seen Gyarados win, we've seen Celebi win. We might have even seen Charizard win at the beginning of the format as well, which I think we might have. I think the first tournament of the Mythical Island format actually saw Charizard win, which probably was an anti-meta pick and a meta call based on, Celebi being exceedingly popular. But I might do kind of this like wrap up video basically telling the whole story of the metagame through Mythical Island before the new set comes out. Maybe we'll have to see, I don't know, but it is just really fun for me to go through every week and see how the meta is changing. But yes, overall, if I'm going to give my forecast for next week, if I'm going to give my recommendations as to what decks we should be playing, especially now that this emblem event is on, well, I think the emblem stuff is a little bit different. I might make a separate video on that because the decks and the people that you play on the ladder, like on random matches in game, are different than in the tournament. It's a very different world. And typically for the emblem events, you want to play like decks that are consistent and have strong matchups across the board. You basically just want to like, you know, cut your losses, and you really want to play something that's consistent and has a good matchup spread overall, and you just want to play a bunch of matches and get lucky. That's kind of, you know, the best way to go about the emblem event. But I'll make a video separately on the emblem event. But yeah, if we're gonna be, again, analyzing things going into next week, what I think will happen, what I would recommend if you're looking to you know, participate in tournaments next week, I think that Mewtwo is still a good choice. Yes, it's been a few weeks since it won the tournament, but it's always dominating top 32. And if you want to have a really solid chance, no matter what, to be one of the top decks in these tournaments, I do think that Mewtwo is a really strong pick. Now, I do think that Pikachu is going to see a pretty heavy decline in play, even though it did get second place. I just think that people are necessarily, things are going to balance out more, and even though it might still be the second most played deck, it's going to be a lot closer to things like Celebi and Gyarados, right? So I think that Celebi, of course, we'll see more play next week, which opens up the room for things like Charizard and Moltres. But overall, I think as we saw, Gyarados actually having a pretty strong matchup against Celebi and a strong matchup against Mewtwo, I would say that the best deck to play in this upcoming week, if we're really trying to make a meta call, is actually going to be Gyarados. I think that Gyarados will kind of go back on the rise. I think that it has a really good position against Mewtwo, and I think Pikachu will go down, Celebi will go up, and I overall think that Gyarados is a really good pick. But yeah, I would say that Mewtwo, Gyarados, Celebi, those should be the top three choices right now. Some anti-meta picks, again, if we go down this Exeggutor and Mew-EX deck, if you didn't want to play something that was particularly high meta, this is kind of my big takeaway of this tournament, basically. We'll talk a little bit more about it in our sort of off-meta report, or our sort of surprise decks report in a few days. But really, this is kind of, for me, like the biggest takeaway of this tournament, is that a deck like this is relatively new. We only saw a couple people playing it, but it did exceptionally well, especially in day one. It was literally the 1 seed after the first 10 games, the first day of competition, which doesn't surprise me. I really think that as far as consistency, you know, tempo decks go, this is really, really up there. It's hard maybe for some people to like fully understand, you know, what you're supposed to be using and what matchups. Like, it's not super straightforward. You kind of play differently no matter what your match, or depending on what your matchup is. But overall, I really think that this might be the biggest takeaway from this particular week of play. I really like this deck. I think that this deck should be like a top 5, 6, 7 most played deck by far. I think it's just really, really good. And I actually like it better than playing Mew, Celebi, and Exeggutor. I would rather swap out that Celebi for Tauros. I just don't necessarily think that Celebi is worth playing if we're not playing Jungle Totem. So, however, like I said, because Celebi with Jungle Totem and Exeggutor won the tournament, that's by far going to be the most played deck. And in fact, it might end up going to be the second most played deck. It's either going to be second or third next week, so I wouldn't be surprised. Like I said, this week it was fourth, but it'll probably be third or second. But yeah, Celebi is going to go up. I would play Gyarados next week. Gyarados is my pick. If you're not going to play Mewtwo, I would play Gyarados. Or if you're not going to play Celebi or Mewtwo, Celebi could just win again, because any of these decks really could win again. But if we're trying to really increase our odds and kind of, you know, make the right decision based off the metagame, I would say that Gyarados is probably my pick, at least going into this next week of competition. But overall, guys, yeah, it's another long ramble video. We do them every week. This one, I've left it to about 43 minutes. So you know what? It's been worse. It's been better, but you know what? Listen, I love doing this. I find it really interesting. I know you guys kind of like these sort of ramble videos. It's something maybe not a lot of people do on YouTube. I literally press record and I just talk for like 45 minutes. Some of you guys probably hate it. Some people think it's ridiculous, but you know, some of you guys enjoy it. So you know what? I really appreciate that. And if you're new to the channel, if you like this video, don't forget to like the video and subscribe. It means a lot to me. It helps out the channel, also helps out the algorithm. Comment below what you think of the metagame right now. Did anything surprise you? What are your thoughts? What decks would you be playing right now into the current metagame? I would love to hear your guys' opinions. Don't forget to comment below. But yeah, guys, we're going to get out of here. Tomorrow, we're going to make a meta tier list. We're going to get back and we're going to make you know, a true meta deck tier list, an updated tier list. So I'm excited for that as well. Stay tuned. That'll be another video. And then after that, we might take a look at the grand finals match if we can get our hands on that that video recording. That could be really interesting to do some commentary about that. But anyway, I am rambling, so I apologize. I'm going to get out of here, guys. Peace out. Have a good one. Like and subscribe. We'll see you next time. We'll see you soon. How do I end videos? I have no idea. Yeah.